He made a bet and married a servant girl, thinking he would be an easy winner. But one night changed everything. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The grand ballroom of William Clark's estate was a dazzling display of wealth and opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the high ceiling, casting a golden glow over polished marble floors. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns filled the room, their laughter and conversations blending with the soft melody of a live orchestra. The air smelled of expensive champagne, rare cigars, and the subtle scent of power. At the center of it all stood William Clark, heir to one of the most powerful financial empires in the country. He was a man who embodied privilege, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes and a face that never betrayed weakness. His posture was commanding, his presence magnetic. He was used to admiration, deference, and the quiet acknowledgement that he was a man who always won. Surrounding him were his closest associates, men of equal wealth but lesser influence. Among them stood Harrison Banks, his longtime friend and occasional rival. Harrison was sharp-witted, a man who enjoyed pushing boundaries and provoking reactions. He took a sip of his wine, his eyes glinting with mischief as he studied William, who stood casually with a glass of whiskey in one hand, his other hand tucked into his pocket. "You always say money can buy anything," Harrison said, his voice smooth but laced with challenge. William raised an eyebrow, only mildly interested. "Because it can." The group around them chuckled. It was an unspoken rule in their world. Money wasn't just a tool, it was the ultimate force. With enough wealth, anyone could be persuaded. Anything could be changed. Harrison smirked, swirling his wine. "That's easy to say when you've never been tested." William exhaled, half amused, half bored. "Is this going somewhere, Harrison, or are you just trying to make yourself sound philosophical?" Harrison leaned in slightly. "Let's put your belief to the test. If money is as powerful as you claim, then prove it." The men around them quieted, their curiosity piqued. William gave a small, unimpressed smile. "And how exactly do you propose I do that?" Harrison's gaze flicked across the room before settling on someone at the far end. "By transforming her." William followed his line of sight. At the edge of the ballroom, near the bar, a woman in a black and white uniform was moving discreetly between guests, refilling glasses and collecting empty plates. She was different from the other women in the room. No glittering gown, no jewelry, no carefully styled hair. Her dark skin contrasted against the pale uniform, her long, thick curls tied back into a low bun. She moved with quiet efficiency, her expression neutral, eyes cast downward, as if she had mastered the art of being invisible in a room full of people who never looked at her. Kyla Johnson, one of the estate's housekeeping staff. William's frown deepened. "You can't be serious." Harrison chuckled. "Why not? She's perfect for this challenge. No money, no connections, no interest in our world." He tilted his head, studying William's face. "Or are you saying that money can't buy everything after all?" William's expression remained unreadable. He was irritated by the suggestion, but intrigued by the challenge. It was absurd, ridiculous even, but that was exactly why he couldn't back down. Refusing would make him look weak, like a man who was afraid of proving himself. The others were watching him, waiting. He took a slow sip of his whiskey before setting the glass down on the table beside him. Then he looked Harrison directly in the eye. 3 months, he said, his voice calm and deliberate. "I marry her, transform her, and make the world believe she belongs by my side." Harrison grinned. "And if you fail?" William's smirk returned. I don't fail." The men around them laughed, raising their glasses in a mock toast to what they saw as William's inevitable success. Harrison extended his hand, and William shook it, sealing the bet. "This is going to be fun," Harrison said, a wicked gleam in his eye. "Just remember, you have to make it look real. She has to be by your side at every event, dressed and behaving like a true society wife." William nodded once. "Then prepare to lose, Harrison." He turned his attention back to Kyla. She was unaware of the conversation that had just taken place, unaware that in a matter of hours her entire life would be upended. William Clark never lost, and he wasn't about to start now. The next morning, Kyla was in the kitchen, stacking clean dishes when she felt a shift in the air. A presence. She turned and found herself face to face with William Clark. She stiffened. "Mr. Clark," she said cautiously. She had worked in this house for nearly a year and had never spoken directly to him before. His blue eyes studied her, sharp and assessing. "I need to talk to you." Kyla wiped her hands on a dish towel, wary. "About what?" His lips curved slightly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "A proposal." She frowned. "A proposal?" William stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "I want you to marry me." The plate she had been holding slipped from her fingers and crashed into the sink, sending a splash of water onto her uniform. She stared at him in disbelief. "What?" "You heard me." His tone was even, as if discussing a business deal. "It's a contract, a marriage of convenience, 3 months, and in return I will pay you an amount that will change your life." Kyla let out a nervous laugh. "That's not funny, Mr. Clark." "I'm not joking." He pulled a check from his pocket and placed it on the counter. The amount was staggering, more money than she had ever seen in her life. "You're struggling, aren't you?" he said, his voice smooth, persuasive. "With this, you can take care of your family, pay off any debts, start fresh." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Why me?" William's expression remained unreadable. "Because you're perfect for this. No one would ever expect me to marry someone like you. That's exactly why it will work." His blunt honesty made her stomach twist. She wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away. But the weight of her mother's medical bills, her younger brother's tuition, the never-ending financial struggle, it all pressed down on her, suffocating. Her fingers curled into fists. "And after 3 months, we divorce." His answer was immediate, indifferent. "No questions, no ties. You go back to your life, and I go back to mine. The only difference is you'll be in a much better position than when you started." Kyla took a deep breath. She knew that entering into this arrangement meant selling a part of herself, but maybe, just maybe, it was her only chance to change her reality. She exhaled slowly. "I accept." William's smirk deepened. "Good. Tomorrow you'll be my wife." He turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Kyla stood there, her heart pounding. She'd just made a deal with the devil, and there was no turning back. The morning sun filtered through the massive windows of the Clark estate, illuminating the polished floors and the meticulously decorated hallways. The house was a place of silent luxury, where wealth was woven into every detail. Gold-trimmed furniture, towering oil paintings, chandeliers that sparkled even in the daylight. But for Kyla Johnson, this was not her world. She sat stiffly on a velvet-upholstered chair in William Clark's private study, her hands clenched together in her lap, trying to steady herself. Her uniform, neatly pressed as always, felt out of place against the grandeur surrounding her. Just yesterday, she had been carrying trays and polishing surfaces, invisible to the people in this house. Now she was about to become its mistress, if only for 3 months. Across from her, William Clark leaned against his desk, calm and composed, as if offering a woman marriage in exchange for money was the most ordinary transaction in the world. "Let's go over this again," he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "This is a contract, not a real marriage in any emotional or legal sense. You'll be my wife in name only, attending social functions by my side. You will live in this house, dress appropriately, and behave according to the standards expected of a Clark." Kyla's jaw tightened. She already despised the way he spoke, as if she were an object he was molding to his liking. "And in return," his lips quirked slightly, almost as if amused by her defiance. "In return, you'll receive a lump sum when the contract ends, enough to cover any financial burden you have." He didn't need to remind her how much money was at stake. That number had been burned into her mind since last night. It was enough to change everything, to get her mother the best medical care, to put her brother through college, to finally escape the cycle of struggle she had been trapped in her entire life. But selling her dignity for it? She inhaled deeply. She had made her decision. "There will be conditions," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I won't be your plaything. I won't tolerate any attempts to control my life outside of what this arrangement requires." William nodded, as if he had expected her to push back. "Fair enough, and I have conditions of my own. You will follow my lead at events. You will dress and act the part. No scandals, no sudden disappearances, no reckless behavior that could damage my reputation." Kyla frowned. "That's it?" William's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "And no emotional attachments. When the contract ends, we go our separate ways." That last part stung more than she wanted to admit. Not because she had any interest in falling for a man like William Clark, but because it was a stark reminder of what she was to him, nothing more than a transaction. "Fine," she said. William extended a document toward her, neatly bound, the pages crisp and untouched. "Then sign." She stared at the paper. Every cell in her body screamed at her to run, but she had spent her whole life running, from poverty, from disappointment, from a world that never seemed to offer her a chance. Now she was making a choice, a cold, calculated choice. She picked up the pen and signed her name. The moment the ink dried, William took the papers and placed them in a folder. "Tomorrow morning, we go to the courthouse. The marriage will be legally registered, though I'll have my lawyers draft an annulment in advance to ensure a clean exit." Kyla exhaled sharply, standing from the chair. "Is that all?" "For now," he said. "You'll receive further instructions from my assistant later today. Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Clark." She flinched at the name. It wasn't hers, not really. Without another word, she turned and left his study, her heart pounding as she walked through the grand halls of the estate. The walls seemed taller now, the ceilings more suffocating. Tomorrow she would no longer be just a maid. Tomorrow she would become William Clark's wife. The following morning, Kyla stood before a full-length mirror in the guest suite that had been hastily prepared for her. Her uniform was gone. In its place was a modest but elegant ivory dress, cinched at the waist with smooth fabric that flowed down to her knees. It was simple compared to the extravagant gowns she had seen at the Clark estate's parties, but on her it felt foreign, as though she had been wrapped in someone else's identity. A knock at the door. She turned, and a woman stepped in, a middle-aged assistant with clipped professional movements. Mr. Clark is waiting in the car. We're leaving now. No pleasantries, just business." Kyla followed in silence. Outside, a sleek black limousine idled in the circular driveway. William stood beside it, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, adjusting the cuff of his shirt as she approached. When he looked up, his gaze flickered briefly over her appearance. "You clean up well," he said. She crossed her arms. "Don't start." His lips curved slightly, but he said nothing as he opened the door for her. Inside the limousine, the air was thick with silence. William scrolled through his phone, completely unbothered, while Kyla stared out the window, watching the city pass by. The further they drove, the more she realized how much her life was about to change. When they arrived at the courthouse, the process was eerily simple. A few signatures, a judge's stamp of approval, and just like that, she was legally Kyla Clark. The reality of it didn't hit her until they stepped outside. Paparazzi had gathered near the entrance, their cameras flashing like relentless fireflies. She tensed, instinctively taking a step back. William placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her forward. "Smile," he murmured. Kyla resisted the urge to shove him away, instead forcing a neutral expression as they walked to the car. The moment the doors shut behind them, she exhaled, pressing her hands against her temples. "This is insane!" William leaned back against the seat, unfazed. "Welcome to my world." She turned to glare at him. "I'm not one of your rich friends, Clark. I don't know how to play this game." His expression remained calm, then learned quickly. The limousine rolled forward, taking them back to the estate. That evening, Kyla was led to a new room, a bedroom that was hers for the duration of the arrangement. It was enormous. Too enormous. The bed alone could have fit 3 of her old apartments inside it. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the furniture sleek and modern, everything carefully curated to exude wealth. She sat on the edge of the bed, feeling out of place. A knock at the door. She stood as William entered, still in his suit, his tie slightly loosened. "This will be your room," he said. "My room is at the end of the hall. There will be no shared spaces aside from public appearances." "Good," she said, lifting her chin. "I don't want to be here more than necessary." William's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't argue. "Tomorrow, you start etiquette training. You'll have a stylist, a speech coach, and a social consultant. I expect you to cooperate." Kyla folded her arms. "You're really determined to erase me, aren't you?" His expression remained unreadable. "I'm determined to win." Kyla's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Of course you are." William turned to leave but paused at the doorway. "Get some rest. You'll need it." She watched him go, feeling the weight of her decision settle onto her shoulders. Tomorrow, her transformation would begin. Tomorrow, she would be one step closer to losing herself. Kyla barely slept that night. The vastness of her new bedroom felt suffocating, its silence heavier than she expected. Everything in the room was expensive, more expensive than anything she had ever owned or touched. The sheets were softer than clouds, the chandelier above her bed glittered even in the darkness, and the air carried the faintest scent of luxury. But none of it felt real. She was no longer a maid in this house, but she wasn't part of it either. She existed in limbo, somewhere between guest and prisoner, between obligation and resentment. The contract she signed weighed on her like chains. Morning came too quickly. A sharp knock at the door jolted her upright. She sat there for a moment, trying to collect herself before finally answering. The same assistant from yesterday, the one who had accompanied them to the courthouse, stood outside. Your schedule starts in 30 minutes. You should get ready. Kyla rubbed her temple. Schedule? The woman gave a clipped nod. You have etiquette training, wardrobe selection, and social protocol lessons today. Mr. Clark expects full cooperation. Of course he does. Kyla bit back a sarcastic reply and closed the door. She took a slow breath, then moved to the massive closet. It was already stocked with clothes, none of which belonged to her. Designer dresses, elegant blouses, shoes that probably cost more than her yearly salary when she was working as a maid. She reached for the simplest dress she could find, a pale blue wrap dress, and changed. Downstairs in one of the estate's many sitting rooms, a group of people awaited her. A poised woman with sharp features and a stiff posture sat at the center of the group. Her gray hair was pulled back into a severe bun, her pearl earrings glinting under the chandelier. Beside her stood a younger woman, a stylist, wearing a chic black ensemble, and a man in thin-framed glasses, who held a notebook in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. Kyla took one look at them and immediately wanted to walk the other way. William, of course, was already there. He sat in a chair near the fireplace, reading something on his phone, his suit perfectly pressed even this early in the morning. When he glanced up and saw her hesitation at the door, his lips curved into something dangerously close to amusement. Kyla, meet Esther, Clara, and Victor, he said smoothly. They'll be responsible for your transformation. Transformation, she echoed, stepping further inside. Right. Because apparently I'm a problem that needs fixing. Esther, the older woman, barely reacted to her tone. Not fixin', she corrected. Refinement. Kyla forced a tight smile. How comforting. William gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sit. She hesitated, but sat. Esther cleared her throat. We'll start with posture and etiquette. You will learn how to sit, walk, and engage in conversation like a woman of status. Kyla raised an eyebrow. I know how to walk. Not properly. William chuckled under his breath. Kyla shot him a glare. Esther continued as if nothing had happened. Your manner of speaking will also be assessed. Clara will handle wardrobe and styling, and Victor will oversee your social adaptability. Within 3 months, you will be unrecognizable. That sent a chill down Kyla's spine. Unrecognizable, she repeated. You mean I'll stop being myself? No, William interjected. You'll stop being the version of yourself that doesn't belong in my world. Kyla clenched her jaw. He said it so matter-of-factly, like it was inevitable. Like she had no choice but to bend to whatever image he wanted her to be. Fine. Let's see who bends first. She straightened in her chair and turned back to Esther. All right then, let's get started. The next several hours were a nightmare. Kyla quickly learned that posture training wasn't just about sitting up straight, it was about control, about how to move with grace, how to walk with effortless elegance, how to position herself in a way that projected confidence without seeming aggressive. You slouch, Esther pointed out for the third time, tapping Kyla's back with the edge of a ruler. Straighten your spine. Kyla exhaled through her nose and obeyed. She was made to walk across the room with books balanced on her head. She was corrected on everything, from how she placed her hands to how she lifted a glass of water. Then came the speech training. Victor had her read from books out loud, stopping her every time she spoke too quickly or used casual phrasing. Your articulation is too rigid, he noted. Relax your tone. Your voice should be commanding, yet inviting. How am I supposed to sound commanding and inviting? Victor sighed as if she had asked the most idiotic question in the world. Practice. It was endless, exhausting, and infuriating. By the time she reached the wardrobe session, Kyla was ready to snap. Clara's team had pulled racks of dresses, shoes, and accessories for her to try on. But every time she put something on, Clara would shake her head and adjust something, pinning fabric, tightening a belt, tilting her head in consideration. "You need color," Clara said finally, pulling out a deep emerald dress. "It'll contrast beautifully against your skin tone." Kyla reluctantly changed into it. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The fabric hugged her in all the right places, the rich color bringing out the depth of her complexion. She looked expensive, like she belonged here. William stood near the doorway, watching. When their eyes met in the mirror, he gave a slight nod. "Not bad," he said. Kyla turned away from the mirror. "Good, we're done then." "Not quite," Esther said. "Now we test you in a real social setting." Kyla stiffened. "What?" William smirked. "Dinner, tonight. A few of my business associates will be there. You'll be seated next to me." Her stomach turned. A public test. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "And what if I embarrass you?" His smirk deepened. "Then I guess you'll be working twice as hard tomorrow." That evening, the Clark estate hosted a private dinner for some of William's business partners. Kyla sat beside him, dressed in the emerald gown, her hair styled in a way that made her feel like someone else. The dining hall was grand, the tables set with crystal glasses and gold-plated silverware. Conversations around her were light, filled with the shallow pleasantries of the elite. She could feel their eyes on her. Harrison Banks, of course, was among the guests. He studied her with a bemused expression, swirling his wine. "So," Harrison said, addressing Kyla for the first time, "how's married life treating you?" Kyla smiled, but there was an edge to it. "Better than expected." Some of the men chuckled. Harrison's smile widened. "I have to admit, William, I underestimated your ability to train." "Careful, Harrison." William cut in smoothly, his tone sharp enough to silence the table. Kyla felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. For the rest of the evening, she played her part perfectly. She didn't let them rattle her. She responded to their probing questions with grace, held eye contact, and controlled her posture like Esther had drilled into her. When the dinner ended, William led her away from the table. "You handled yourself well," he admitted. Kyla exhaled. "Is that an actual compliment?" He gave her a look she couldn't quite read. "Don't get used to it." She smirked. "Oh, don't worry, I won't." As she walked ahead of him, William found himself watching her. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated her too. Kyla woke up the next morning feeling as if she had survived a battlefield. Her body ached from the hours spent perfecting her posture. Her mind was exhausted from calculating every word, every glance, every movement. But the worst part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the realization that, against all odds, she had succeeded. She had walked into that dinner last night an outsider, a woman who didn't belong. And yet, by the end of it, she had held her own. She hadn't cracked under the pressure of Harrison's smirks or the scrutinizing stares of the other guests. She had proven that she wasn't just a pawn in William Clark's little game. She was a player in her own right, but that didn't mean she liked any of it. When she made her way downstairs, she found William already in the dining room, casually scrolling through his phone while his breakfast, eggs, toast, perfectly arranged fruit, sat untouched in front of him. He didn't look up as she entered. "You're late," he said. Kyla grabbed a piece of toast from the tray on the table. I didn't realize we were on a schedule. William finally glanced at her, eyes assessing. We are now. I have a charity event this evening, and you're coming with me. She stopped mid-bite. Excuse me? He took a sip of his coffee. It's a fundraiser for a hospital I've donated to. Press will be there, along with some important business partners. It's a good opportunity to solidify your role as my wife. Kyla crossed her arms. I just survived one of your social tests. You really think I'm going to another one willingly? His expression remained unreadable. I don't recall asking for your willingness. She exhaled sharply. Of course. This was who William Clark was. Commanding, unapologetic, always in control. Fine, she said, but let's be clear. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because the sooner I get through these ridiculous events, the sooner I can be done with this arrangement. William smirked slightly, as if amused by her defiance. Whatever helps you sleep at night, Kyla. The charity event was held at an exclusive venue downtown, the kind of place where chandeliers dripped from the ceiling and servers carried trays of champagne as effortlessly as they breathed. Kyla arrived on William's arm, her emerald dress replaced by a sleek navy gown, her hair swept up in a way that made her look effortlessly elegant. The cameras flashed the moment they stepped out of the limousine, blinding bursts of light surrounding them. She had to fight the urge to squint. Smile, William murmured, his grip on her waist firm but not possessive. Kyla turned her head slightly toward him, plastering on the kind of composed expression she had practiced in the mirror. Perfect, he said. They moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with people who mattered in William's world. He introduced her effortlessly. My wife, Kyla, as if she had always been a part of this life. She noticed how people reacted to her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. They saw her as an anomaly, an unexpected twist in William Clark's otherwise predictable existence. Then, as expected, Harrison Banks appeared. He was dressed impeccably, as always, a glass of scotch in hand and a knowing smirk on his lips. You clean up well, Kyla, he said smoothly, his gaze sweeping over her. She gave him a tight smile. Why, thank you, Harrison. I do try. Harrison chuckled. Charming. William, I have to admit, I thought this would be over by now, but look at you, still playing house. William's expression didn't change. I don't play games I can't win. Kyla forced herself to remain neutral, though something about the way Harrison spoke made her uneasy. He was watching them too closely, as if searching for cracks in the illusion. William must have sensed it too, because he suddenly wrapped an arm around Kyla's waist, pulling her just a fraction closer. It was a calculated move, one meant to appear effortless, but she felt the tension in his body. Harrison raised his glass in a mock toast. Well, here's to proving us all wrong. He walked away, leaving behind a trail of amusement and something darker, something that felt like a warning. Kyla looked up at William. He doesn't believe us. He doesn't have to, William said, as long as no one else does. The night continued without incident, but something shifted. William had always been composed, but Kyla noticed that he was more on edge tonight, more aware of the eyes on them, more deliberate in his actions. At one point, they were standing near the back of the room, away from the crowd. William's expression was unreadable as he sipped his drink. What's wrong? Kyla asked. He glanced at her. Nothing. She raised an eyebrow. You expect me to believe that? A muscle in his jaw tightened. It's just, Harrison enjoys pushing limits. He always has. She frowned. And I don't like giving him reasons to think he's ahead. Kyla studied him for a moment. This was about more than just Harrison's skepticism. It was about control. William needed to be the one in charge, the one dictating the terms. "You know," she said, tilting her head, "if you weren't such a control freak, you might actually be tolerable." William let out a quiet laugh. "And if you weren't so stubborn, you might actually be likable." Kyla smirked. "Unlikely." His gaze lingered on her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "Yeah, probably." The moment stretched between them, neither of them willing to break it first. For the first time, Kyla wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to William Clark than the cold businessman she had agreed to marry, and that thought unsettled her more than anything else. Over the next few weeks, the routine continued. Kyla was forced into a rigorous schedule: daily etiquette lessons, speech training, wardrobe fittings. She was drilled on every detail of high society life, from how to hold a wine glass to how to engage in meaningless small talk without seeming disinterested, and she hated every second of it. But she adapted, because Kyla Johnson had never been the type to give up, even when the odds were stacked against her. She also started noticing things, like how the staff at the estate, once wary of her presence, had started to show her quiet respect, how some of them, who had once barely acknowledged her, now greeted her with warm smiles. She noticed how William watched her too, how his sharp, assessing gaze had become something different, something almost intrigued, and that was the most dangerous part, because she wasn't supposed to care. She wasn't supposed to wonder what lay beneath William's perfectly controlled exterior, but she was starting to, and she had no idea what to do about it. Kyla had always trusted her instincts. It was what had kept her alive, what had helped her navigate a world that wasn't made for people like her. So when a feeling of unease settled deep in her gut, she didn't ignore it. It had started subtly. Harrison watching them too closely at events, his comments laced with something more than just his usual amusement. Then there was William, who had begun to act differently. He was still composed, still in control, but Kyla could sense the shift. He was more watchful, more guarded, as if he knew something was about to unravel. And it did. It happened one evening in the most unexpected way. Kyla had been in the estate's library looking for something to read. It was one of the only places in the mansion where she felt a semblance of peace. The towering bookshelves, the scent of aged paper, the silence. It reminded her of afternoons spent in the public library as a child, escaping into stories where people like her could be heroes instead of survivors. She had just pulled a book from the shelf when a rustling sound caught her attention. At first, she thought she was imagining it. But then she saw something slip under the library door, a manila folder. Frowning, she set the book down and crossed the room, picking up the folder. There was no name, no indication of who had left it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were papers, documents, and as she read them, her entire world tilted. Her hands clenched the pages so tightly they crumpled at the edges. A contract, a bet, a wager made between William and Harrison. Kyla's breath turned shallow. Every muscle in her body tightened. She scanned the documents, her eyes flying over the terms, the conditions, the timeline, the $10 million prize. The reality of it slammed into her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just an arrangement. It had never been just a business deal between them. This was a game. And she had been the pawn. Kyla's vision blurred, heat rising in her chest. She wanted to scream, to break something, to throw the folder against the wall. But more than that, she wanted answers. She stormed out of the library, her feet moving on instinct, her pulse pounding in her ears. William was in his office when she found him, leaning over his desk, reviewing documents like nothing had changed. Like he wasn't the kind of man who could look someone in the eye and lie without hesitation. She didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the folder down onto his desk. William looked up, his brow furrowing at her sudden intrusion. But then his gaze dropped to the folder, and for the first time since she'd met him, Kyla saw something close to shock flicker across his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice too calm. Kyla ignored the question. "Tell me it's not real." William exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "Kyla, tell me you didn't make a bet with Harrison. Tell me you didn't marry me just so you could prove a damn point." She cut him off, her voice shaking with fury. He was silent. That was all the answer she needed. Her stomach twisted, her chest ached. She had known William Clark was cold, calculating, ruthless. But this was something else. This was cruel. Her hands curled into fists. "So this whole time, I was just part of some twisted challenge? Some prize for you to win?" His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Something she hadn't seen before. Regret? Guilt? It didn't matter. "You said you needed a wife," she continued, her voice breaking. "But what you really needed was a project, a way to feed your ego." "Kyla," he said her name like it was supposed to fix things, like it was supposed to mean something. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "And I fell for it. God, I actually started to believe—" She cut herself off, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing that she had let her guard down, that she had started to trust him, that she had felt something. Her breath hitched. She turned away from him, shaking her head. "I was such an idiot." William stood then, stepping around the desk. "Kyla." She moved before he could reach her, putting space between them. "Don't." Her voice was firm, sharp like a blade. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify this. You used me." "I didn't." "Yes, you did," she snapped, her anger boiling over. "And you knew exactly what you were doing." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Kyla took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady. "I'm done," she said quietly. "I'm leaving." A muscle in William's jaw ticked. "That's not part of the agreement." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Screw the agreement." And with that, she turned and walked out of his office. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She walked straight to her room, grabbed a suitcase, and started throwing clothes inside. She didn't have much. Most of the wardrobe here had been chosen for her, selected to fit the version of herself that William wanted to present to the world. But there were a few things that were hers. She grabbed them all. When she finished, she turned, ready to leave, only to find William standing in the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment. "Where will you go?" Kyla lifted her chin. "Anywhere that isn't here." His gaze darkened. "You don't have to do this." She let out a breath. "And you didn't have to make a bet on my life." His silence was answer enough. Without another word, she pushed past him and walked out of the room. Out of the house, out of his life. She left the Clark estate that night with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of betrayal. She found a small motel downtown, far from the world she had just escaped. The walls were thin, the sheets weren't silk, and there were no chandeliers overhead. But at least it was hers. At least it was real. She sat on the bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had no job, no security, no plan, but she had something more important. She had her freedom. and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her again, not even William Clark. Especially not him. Kyla had always thought freedom would feel lighter than this. She had spent years dreaming of the day she would finally escape the suffocating weight of financial struggle, of living paycheck to paycheck, of constantly having to choose between rent and groceries. But now, as she sat on the edge of a motel bed, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, she realized that freedom could be just as heavy as the burdens she had carried before. She had left the Clark estate with nothing but a suitcase and her pride. No job, no stability, no plan. But at least she had her dignity. At least she was no longer a pawn in William Clark's game. A bitter laugh bubbled in her throat. How had she ever thought, even for a second, that he was anything more than what he appeared to be? A man who took what he wanted. A man who never lost. A man who had bet on her life and played it like a business deal. Her hands clenched into fists at the memory of the contract, the ink that had sealed her fate long before she had even known she was in the game. And yet, even now, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Not about the bet, not about the deception, but about the moments in between. The nights when they had talked about their childhoods, the way his voice had softened when he had spoken of his mother. The rare flashes of something unguarded in his expression, as if he himself wasn't sure of what he was feeling. She shook her head violently, forcing the thoughts away. It didn't matter. Whatever she thought she had seen in him had been a lie. The first few weeks were hard. Kyla managed to find a waitressing job at a small cafe downtown. It was nothing glamorous, but it was honest work, and it paid enough to keep her going. She fell into the routine easily. Early mornings, late nights, sore feet. It was a world she understood, a world that made sense. But no matter how much she tried to focus on rebuilding her life, the ghost of William Clark haunted her. She saw his name in the newspapers, his image flashing across business segments on TV screens in the cafe. He was still everywhere, unshaken, untouched, as if her leaving hadn't even made a dent in his perfect world. Of course it hadn't. Men like William Clark didn't lose. And yet, something gnawed at her, an itch in the back of her mind she couldn't scratch. She had expected William to send his lawyers after her, to demand she return, to remind her that she had signed a contract. But no one came. No threats, no demands, no William. It was as if he had let her go. That should have made her feel victorious. It should have made her feel like she had won. But all it did was leave her with a lingering question. Why? She got her answer sooner than she expected. It happened on a random afternoon when she was finishing her shift at the cafe. She was wiping down a table when she heard his name. William Clark, the billionaire, has been making some unexpected moves lately. Kyla's head snapped up. The TV above the counter was playing a news report. She grabbed a rag and pretended to clean, inching closer to listen. The screen flashed with images of William, dressed impeccably, as always, stepping out of a black car, surrounded by a group of people who looked different. They weren't business executives. They weren't celebrities. They were community leaders, teachers, volunteers. Kyla frowned. Clark, known for his ruthless business strategies, has been dedicating his time and resources to philanthropic efforts in lower-income communities. Sources say he has personally donated millions to educational and housing programs. Kyla's grip on the rag tightened. What? The billionaire, who has always kept his distance from public charity work, has surprised many by taking a hands-on approach, visiting schools, speaking with local organizations, even personally overseeing some of the projects. Kyla barely registered the rest of the report. She didn't understand. William Clark didn't do charity. He didn't waste time on things that didn't give him a return on investment. So why the hell was he suddenly dedicating himself to causes she had spent years fighting for? Why was he showing up in her world? That question burned in her mind for days. She told herself she didn't care, that whatever William was doing wasn't her problem, that he could throw money at whatever charity he wanted. It didn't change anything. But the doubt wouldn't leave her. Had he changed, or was this just another game? A week later, she got her chance to find out. She had just finished restocking shelves in the cafe when the bell above the door chimed. She turned, and her breath stopped. William Clark stood in the entrance, dressed in a tailored but understated suit, his piercing blue eyes locked onto her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kyla set down the coffee pot she was holding and walked straight past him. "Kyla." She didn't stop. She couldn't. "Kyla, wait." She made it as far as the back hallway before his voice stopped her again. "Please." Something about that word made her hesitate. She turned, arms crossed, her jaw tight. "What do you want?" William exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to find the right words. For the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain. "I need to talk to you." Kyla let out a short laugh. "We don't have anything to talk about." "Yes, we do." His voice was quieter now. "I was wrong. About everything." Her chest tightened. "And you think saying that makes it better?" "No," he admitted. "But it's the truth." Silence stretched between them. Then, against her better judgment, she spoke. "Why are you here, William?" He hesitated. Then, finally, he answered, "Because I couldn't stand the thought of you believing that you didn't matter." Her breath caught. She stared at him, searching his face, looking for the lie. But for the first time, she couldn't find one. They sat outside the cafe, away from prying eyes. William told her everything. About how he had thrown away the bet money. About how he had started working with the community projects because she had made him realize how hollow his life had been. About how, for the first time, he had started questioning everything he had ever believed in. Kyla listened. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she believed him, and that scared her more than anything, because it meant that somewhere, deep down, she wasn't done with him either. Over the next few weeks, Kyla watched him. She tested him. She visited one of the projects he had funded, talked to the people there. She saw the way he interacted with them. Not like a man fulfilling a PR obligation, but like a man who was trying to be better, trying to be worthy, and against all odds, he was succeeding. One evening, as they sat on a park bench near the cafe, William turned to her. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," he said, "but I'm asking for one anyway." Kyla looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she let herself wonder, maybe people could change. Maybe, just maybe. She was willing to find out. Kyla didn't believe in easy redemption. People didn't just wake up one morning and decide to be better. Change was messy, painful. It required more than words. It required action, patience, and consistency. And trust, that was the hardest thing of all. She had learned long ago that trust was fragile, that it could be shattered in an instant. And William Clark had shattered it in the worst way possible. But now, as she sat across from him in the quiet cafe, watching the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life ask instead of demand, she realized something unsettling. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the William Clark who had played with her life like it was a game was gone, replaced by someone who was trying to understand. But wanting to believe and actually believing were two different things. Over the next few weeks, William didn't push. He didn't flood her with expensive gestures or grand declarations. He didn't try to buy her forgiveness the way he had once tried to buy her obedience. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He showed up, again and again. He kept coming back to the cafe, not as a billionaire reclaiming what he had lost, but as a man who was learning. He asked about her world, about the struggles that people in her community faced every day, the struggles he had once ignored. He listened to the answers without trying to fix things with money. And when she finally gave in to her curiosity and agreed to visit one of his projects, what she saw shocked her. The community center was nothing like she expected. It wasn't some soulless building with William's name plastered all over it like a monument to his wealth. It wasn't a charity designed for photo ops and media coverage. It was real. She watched as kids from underprivileged neighborhoods played in the newly built playground, as teachers helped struggling students with their homework. She saw families picking up food from the donation center, not with the empty politeness reserved for wealthy benefactors, but with genuine relief. And then she saw him. William wasn't standing off to the side, observing from a distance like a man who had simply written a check and moved on. He was there, talking to a single mother about the job training program the center had started, kneeling to speak with a young boy about his favorite book, helping an elderly woman carry a box of groceries to her car. Keela didn't know what she had expected. Maybe she had expected to catch him in a lie, to find proof that this was just another game, another transaction. But she didn't. What she found instead was something far more unsettling. She found a man who was trying, and she didn't know what to do with that. After that, things began to shift. Kyla still kept her distance, but she started answering his questions instead of shutting him out. She let him walk her home sometimes after her shifts at the cafe, even though she told herself she didn't need his company. She started to see the cracks in the man she had once thought was unbreakable. William Clark had been born into power, raised to believe that money was the only thing that mattered. But for the first time, he was standing in a world where money wasn't the solution to everything. And he was learning. She saw it in the way he hesitated before speaking sometimes, as if he was trying to choose the right words. She saw it in the way he listened, really listened, when people spoke about their struggles. And most of all, she saw it in the way he looked at her. Not like a prize. Not like a bet, but like someone he respected. One night, after a particularly long shift, she found him waiting for her outside the cafe. The city lights cast long shadows, the air thick with the scent of rain. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "You really don't give up, do you?" William smirked, but there was something softer in his expression. "Not when it's important." She studied him, searching for any trace of the man who had once stood before her with an ironclad contract and a smug certainty that he could control her life. But she didn't see that William anymore. Instead, she saw a man who was standing in front of her, not above her. And that scared her more than anything, because it meant that, despite everything, despite the lies, despite the betrayal, her heart was starting to betray her. Again. They started spending time together, not in the grand, orchestrated way that William's world demanded, but in quiet, unexpected moments, like when he showed up at the cafe one evening and sat in the corner reading while she worked. He didn't demand attention, didn't try to insert himself into her space. He just was there. Or when she found herself telling him stories about her childhood, about her mother's laugh, about the nights she spent tutoring her younger brother under a flickering apartment light, or when he admitted one night that he had never once set foot in his father's office as a child because the man had believed that emotions were distractions, that family was secondary to success. Kyla didn't know what was happening between them. She didn't want to name it, but it was real, and that terrified her. One evening, as they walked through a park near her apartment, William stopped suddenly. She turned to him, frowning. "What?" He hesitated for a moment, then exhaled. "You were right about me." Kyla's stomach twisted. "About what?" He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something unmasked in his expression. "About everything." Silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Then, quietly, he added, "I don't expect you to forgive me." Kyla swallowed. "Then why are you still here?" His lips curved slightly. "Because I'm not done proving that I'm different." She wanted to look away, to pretend that his words didn't affect her, but she couldn't, because somehow, against all logic, against every defense she had built, a part of her believed him, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Kyla realized something. She had spent so long thinking of William Clark as the enemy, but now she wasn't sure what he was anymore. And maybe, just maybe, neither was he. Kyla had never been afraid of making tough decisions. Her entire life had been built on them, choosing between paying rent or medical bills, between staying in a dead-end job or risking unemployment, between holding on to her pride or swallowing it for the sake of survival. But this was different. This was the first time in her life where the decision wasn't about survival. This was about trust. And trusting William Clark was the most terrifying thing she had ever considered. The days passed in an uneasy rhythm. William didn't push, didn't demand answers, but he was there, consistently, patiently. It was a strange reversal from the man she had first met, the man who had orchestrated her life with contracts and conditions. This version of William was different. He was present, not as a force of power, but as a person. He listened when she spoke, not out of curiosity, but out of genuine interest. He didn't offer her money or solutions when she spoke about her struggles. He simply listened. And that was what unsettled her the most. Because it was real. Because it felt real. And Kyla had never allowed herself to hope for real. One evening, after closing the cafe, she found herself walking alongside William again, their steps in sync, the city quiet around them. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer sharp, no longer built on resentment or obligation. Instead, it was something quieter, something unspoken. She hated how comfortable it felt. At some point, they stopped at a small park, sitting on a wooden bench that overlooked the dimly lit street. Kyla exhaled, running a hand over her face. "I don't know what to do with you." William, sitting beside her, let out a low chuckle. "You and me both." She turned to face him fully, her gaze sharp. "Why are you still here, William?" He was silent for a moment, his fingers clasped together between his knees. Then, finally, he spoke. "Because I want to be." The words were so simple, so free of manipulation or calculation, that they stole her breath. She studied him, waiting for the catch, the carefully crafted reasoning that always lay beneath his words. But there was none. Just honesty. And that terrified her more than any contract ever had. William had spent his entire life in control. Everything had a plan, a purpose. Every decision he made had been calculated for efficiency, for gain. But Kyla, she had destroyed that control the moment she walked away from him. And now, sitting beside her, watching the way the soft glow of streetlights caught in her dark curls, he realized something. He didn't want control anymore. He just wanted her. Silence stretched between them, filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Then, finally, William spoke again. "I never expected to change," he admitted, "but you made me want to." Kyla's breath hitched. She looked at him, at the raw sincerity in his expression, and knew he meant it. But words weren't enough. She had heard beautiful words before. She had been fed empty promises before. So she asked the only question that mattered. "How do I know this isn't just another game?" William's jaw tensed. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a velvet box. Kyla's heart stopped. He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Because this time, there's no contract." Her throat tightened. William opened the box. Inside was a ring. Simple, elegant, nothing flashy or excessive. Nothing that screamed wealth, just something real. Kyla stared at it, at the quiet confession it held, and felt her walls crack. "I don't expect you to say yes," William said softly. "I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I needed you to know this isn't about winning anymore. This isn't about proving a point." He swallowed, his voice quieter now. "This is about you." Kyla's vision blurred. She had never been the kind of woman who believed in fairy tales. But this felt like something close to magic. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to believe in it. 2 months later, she stood in the garden of the Clark estate, the very place where her life had been rewritten, wearing a white dress that wasn't chosen for appearance, but for herself. She looked at the man waiting at the end of the aisle, the man who had once been her captor and had somehow become her choice. And for the first time in her life, Kyla Johnson chose love. Not out of necessity. Not out of survival. But because, against all odds, she had finally found something real. And this time it was hers. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let us know in the comments what you think about the ending. Check out more great stories by clicking on the next video, and don't forget to share this one with your friends.